For our authentication UI, we're going to start by building a root composable function. This authentication composable will be used to house all of the composable UI for the authentication screen. For this, we'll create a new Kotlin file called Authentication to keep our composables nicely organized, followed by creating a new composable function, Authentication. This composable is going to be the entry point for our authentication screen, so you don't want this function to have to take any arguments. The point that is navigating to authentication will be able to just compose this function, and this composable will handle everything else. While you won't see anything visual just yet, you want to compose this authentication composable within the set content block of the activity that was just created through the project wizard. Within this root level composable, we're going to want to force our application theme on the composables that are contained inside of it. So we'll add a material theme composable declaration here. Wrapping a composable hierarchy in a theme allows all components to be consistently styled. In most cases, this can happen at the highest point of composition, even within the set content function of the parent activity that is composing the UI. This now means that our composables that are composed in this block of our material theme will be themed according to the colors and styles that are declared within this. Saying that though, we don't currently have any composers that are going to make up the content of our authentication form. We're going to go ahead and create a new file here called authentication content, adding a composable function with a corresponding name. This will take a modifier with a default modifier argument so that the parent composable inside of this can have constraints applied to it. The difference with this composable function is that it's going to be responsible for composing our UI based on the state of the screen, meaning that this function is going to take some form of arguments other than the modifier. Because it's composing UI based on our state, it's also going to need to propagate any events so that the state can be updated accordingly. For this reason, it's also going to need to be able to handle the authentication event types that we previously defined. We need to define two additional arguments here for our composable to satisfy these requirements. We'll add the authentication state, which can be passed into it to compose the UI, along with a handle event function, which will take this event and propagate it to the parent. So why can't this be the entry point for our authentication screen? One clear thing here is that this decouples the composable with being concerned about how the state is provided. Passing in the state via an argument makes it simpler, as in, it gets past the state and composes UI based on it. This also makes it much easier to write tests for our composable, because we can simply pass it a state object and perform assertions based on that, rather than needing to simulate user actions and perform mocking to produce expected states. With this composable defined, we can then hop up to the root authentication composable and compose our authentication content inside of this theme block. However, things aren't quite satisfied here yet, as we need to provide both the state and event handler. For this, we're going to be using our authentication view model that we created in the previous session. So that we can access this information, we're going to need to obtain this view model instance inside of our composable, using the view model compose package that we added as a dependency. This will retrieve an instance of the desired view model, creating one if it does not currently exist. We can then use this view model within our root composable for required arguments. We'll use collect state to collect the emissions of our state flow reference from our view model as a composable state. We'll then pass the value of this emission as a state reference to our composable. And for event handling, our view model contains a function that matches the requirements of our lambda function argument. We can pass this function reference directly to our composable using view model handle event. With this in place, we have a composable function that will house the composables making up our authentication UI. As you might remember when we created the authentication state, there's a lot to take into account when it comes to the UI. While there is plenty of space for there to be more complexity and conditions to think about in regards to the state, we have plenty to think about here already when it comes to building the UI.